Hey everybody, this is Don, aka the Interactive Nanny, coming to you guys this weekend from Interactive Nanny's World, where love and play are interacting, and I am so glad to be with you guys again this week. And I hope you guys have a safe and wonderful week, children. I hope you guys have been trying to enjoy school as best as you can under the circumstances. So we're gonna just jump right into it. We have a topic this week for our geared based mainly for our mommies, and that topic is self-care for mommy. And then after we go through our topic, we'll actually continue with another chapter in our book that we read last week, which was Peter Pan for our little ones. Okay, so we're talking about self-care for mommy, which you can actually apply to anybody, but for the sake of the topic, self-care for mommy. One of the most important jobs in the world is being a mommy. Hands down. Being a mom entails many, many roles. Let's see. There's being the cook, laundry attendant, nurse, referee, driver, chaperone, problem solver, teacher, therapist, confidant, tear wiper, and all-around advocate for our little ones. Among other things, there are many, many more hats that a mom wears. There are no off days, no vacation or sick days, no overtime pay, no monetary pay. You work around the clock, 24/7, no break time. Once you become a mommy, that's it. Once a mommy, always a mommy. Some mommies also work outside the home as well. So you can just imagine how this girl must feel. Not to mention those that are mommies and have significant others. What kind of me time does she actually have? None, it seems. But as a mom, we must take some kind of time for ourselves and take care of us. If we don't take care of us, we won't be able to take care of everybody else and all of our other activities and responsibilities. So we have to take care of us. So I figured I'll just take time to list a few ways that we as mommies can get a little me time. Ways we can get rejuvenated, relaxed, rest. Some of these options are budget friendly, and you can also create and tailor how you want to implement these suggestions. So sit back, relax, listen, and take note. Give yourselves permission to take care of one of the most important people to you, which is you. I'll list ways today, and in coming weeks, we'll discuss each of the suggestions. Let's see. There are spa days or spa nights, nail days or nail evenings, guys. Movie days, nights, lunch dates, and or dinner dates. Spending time with your girlfriends. You have library time, reading. You can walk in the park. A little retail therapy don't hurt as long as you keep the main things the main things. Girls trips, even just some good old sleep. Uninterrupted. All you can do just one or a combination of any. So keep going, stay positive, and let's start taking care of you, mommy. And so that's our topic, which, we're just talking about mommies taking care of mommy. Because if mommy don't take care of mommy, mommy can't take care of nobody. So, got mommies, dads. I know some of you guys need dad. They need to take care of dad too. So just apply it. And now we would go on and get into chapter 2 of our chapter book, which is Peter Pan. So chapter 2 is entitled The Shadow. Peter numbly darted to the window with Nana snapping at his toes. He quickly leaned through the open window, which closed with a bang behind him. Mrs. Darling cried out again, for she was certain the boy was killed. After all, the children's room was quite a distance from the street. She ran to the window to see where he had fallen, but the street was clear. Mrs. Darling looked into the dark night sky. It was empty except for a bright shooting star. Nana came and stood by the window, clutching something in her mouth. It was the boy's shadow. The closing window had torn it off as neatly as a sheet of paper from a roll. It was an ordinary shadow that Nana knew immediately what to do. She hung it out of the window so the boy could find it without disturbing the children. "We can't leave it there," Miss Darling said. "It would look like wash hung out to dry. What would the neighbors think?" She thought to show the shadow to Mr. Darling, but he would only say, "That's what happens when you have a dog for a nurse." Since she had to do something, Mrs. Darling rolled up the shadow and tucked it away in a drawer. She would leave it there until the right time came to tell her husband what had happened. The right time came the very next Friday. It was a day the Darlings would never forget. "I should have known to be more careful on Friday," Mrs. Darling said later. Mr. Darling patted her tenderly on the shoulder. "No, my dear," he said. "I'm responsible for what happened." "No, it was my fault," Miss Darling replied. They could not agree on who was to blame, nor could they forget the events of that fateful day. "If only I had not accepted the invitation to dine out at our neighbor's," Mrs. Darling said. "If only I had not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl," Mr. Darling said. Nana's eyes clouded up as if to say, "If only I had pretended to like the medicine." Mr. Darling wiped away Nana's tears. Each one felt they alone were to blame, and sometimes they blamed Peter. That fiend, Mr. Darling would cry, to which Nana barked in agreement. But Mrs. Darling never blamed Peter. And so they sat in an empty nursery night after night, remembering the events of that dreadful Friday night. It had started quite ordinarily. Nana filled Michael's bath and carried him to it on her broad back. "I won't go to bed," Michael protested as if he made the rules. I won't. Mrs. Darling entered the nursery wearing a lovely evening gown. Around her neck was the necklace that Mr. Darling had given her. On her wrist was Wendy's bracelet, which she borrowed. Wendy loved to see her dressed so prettily. Wendy and John were pretending to be Mr. and Mrs. Darling. First, John said, "Mrs. Darling, you have a baby daughter." Hearing that, Wendy danced with joy, just as her mother must have done when she was born. Then John said, "And now you have a baby son," meaning himself when he was born. Wendy smiled brightly at the news. "I want to be born too," Michael said as he came from his bath. "We don't want any more children," John said. Michael's face clouded and he nearly burst into tears. "Nobody wants me," he said. "I do," said Wendy. Michael was not sure she meant it. "A boy or a girl?" he asked. "A boy," Wendy shouted, and Michael leapt happily into her arms. Later, the Darlings and Nana remembered that last night the children were in the nursery. That was when I dashed in, wasn't it?" Mr. Darling said, interrupted their reminiscence. "Sorry, y'all." That night, Mr. Darling had also dressed for their dinner out, but he could not tie his tie. He rushed into the nursery with an untied tie dangling from his hand. "This tie refuses to tie around my neck," he said. "It does quite well around the bedpost, but it will not tie around my neck. We would not go to dinner. If it would not tie around my neck, we would not go to dinner. If we don't go to dinner, I won't ever go to my office again. If I don't go to my office, we shall starve and our children will be thrown into the street." Mrs. Darling was calm. "Let me do it, dear," she said, because she knew that's exactly what he'd come for, to learn if they would be thrown into the street or not. With quick hands, Miss Darling tied the rebellious tie. Once it was done, Mr. Darling relaxed. Soon the whole family was dancing gaily around the room. What fun it was, Miss Darling said, recalling that Friday night, our last romp together, Mr. Darling said with a sigh. Miss Darling's face turned sad. They were ours, and now they're gone, she said. But even the sadness could not stop the Darlings' memories of that night. Soon Nana joined the happy throng, and she romped amid the flying feet. As she romped amid the flying feet, she brushed against Mr. Darling's brand new trousers, covering them with hair. Oh, what a mistake to have a dog for a nurse, he said angrily. Mrs. Darling brushed away the hairs. Nana's a treasure, she said. I have the feeling she thinks the children are puppies, Mr. Darling said. Miss Darling shook her head. No, George. I'm sure she knows they have souls. Mr. Darling rubbed his chin. Well, you may be sure, he said, but I'm not. To quickly change the subject, Mrs. Darling told her husband about the strange boy who had flown in the window. Nonsense, Mr. Darling said. Then let me show you, Mrs. Darling said. She went to the drawer and pulled out the shadow. Mr. Darling sighed, rubbing his chin once more, but this time in earnest. It's nobody I know, he said, as he examined the shadow, but he looks like a scoundrel if you ask me. Just then, Nana entered with a bottle of Michael's medicine in her mouth. I don't want to take my medicine, Michael cried. I'll get you some chocolate to make it easier to take, Mrs. Darling said, leaving the room. Don't pamper him, Mr. Darling said to his wife. He turned to Michael. When I was your age, I took my medicine without a sound, he said to his son. I even knew to thank my parents for giving me medicine to make me well. He believed what he was saying, and Wendy believed it too. The medicine you have to take now is worse, isn't it? Wendy asked her father. Much, Mr. Darling said. Why, if I knew where it was, I'd take some to show you how easy it is. Wendy, always eager to help out, said, I know where it is, Father, she said. She hurried out of the room before Mr. Darling could stop her. Mr. Darling felt suddenly ill, but not in a way that medicine could help. He turned to John and said quietly, my medicine is beastly stuff to take, John. It is nasty, sticky. It is the nasty, sticky kind. Wendy returned with Mr. Darling's medicine in a glass. Here it is, she said, handing him the glass. It will soon be over, Father, John said cheerfully. Michael has to take his first, Mr. Darling insisted. No, you first, Michael said suspiciously. It will make me sick, Mr. Darling replied. Take it, Father, said John. Hold your tongue, Mr. Darling shot back sharply. Wendy was quite puzzled. I thought you said you didn't mind taking your medicine, Father, she said. That's not the point, Mr. Darling said. He glanced around for an excuse not to take his medicine. He spied the spoon with Michael's medicine. The point is, I have more medicine in my glass than Michael has in his spoon, he said, and that's not fair. Michael was not persuaded. I'm waiting, he said coldly. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Darling responded. Father's a cowardly custard, Michael said. Well, so are you, Mr. Darling said weakly. I'm not afraid to take my medicine, Michael said. Neither am I, Mr. Darling answered without thinking. Well then, take it then, Michael said quickly. Wendy stepped in between them. Why don't you both take your medicine at the same time, she suggested. I'll count to 3, and it was a splendid idea. All right, Mr. Darling agreed. Are you ready, Michael? Michael nodded. 1, 2, 3, Wendy counted. Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling quickly slipped his glass behind his back. No fair, Michael shouted. Oh, Father, Wendy exclaimed. Just then, Nana stepped out of the room. Mr. Darling quickly changed the subject. I just thought of a splendid joke, he said with a mischievous grin. I'll put my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she'll drink it and never know. He poured the milky-looking medicine into the dog's bowl before anyone could say no. What fun, Mr. Darling said. The children eyed their father with scolding looks. They said nothing when Mrs. Darling and Nana returned in the nursery. Mr. Darling petted Nana fondly. Good dog, he said. Here's some milk in your bowl. Nana wagged her fluffy tail and she quickly drank the medicine. The tail suddenly stopped wagging. She turned to Mr. Darling with a sad look. She tucked her tail between her legs and crept to her bed. Mr. Darling was terribly ashamed of what he'd done, but he refused to admit it. Mrs. Darling sniffed the bowl. "Oh, George," she said with reproach, "it's your medicine." "I was only joking," Mr. Darling said. Wendy went to Nana's side and hugged her. "A lot of good it does to be funny around here," Mr. Darling said. "After all, who am I except the one who earns the money so we can live?" He realized his argument was lame, but he had no other. He could not afford to look weak in front of his family. "You coddle that dog, but you won't let me make a joke? So be it. I'll not have that dog ruling my house for another minute." Nana knew instantly what he was saying. The children did too, and they began to cry. Mr. Darling felt strong again. "I made my decision," he said, looking down at Nana. "The proper place for you is in the yard, and that's where you're going this instant." Mrs. Darling stepped in and put things right. "George," she said in a whisper, "remember what I told you about that boy." Mr. Darling did not listen. He was determined to show one and all who was the master of the family. "Come with me, Nana," he said firmly. Nana did not move, so he grabbed her collar and dragged her from the room. He was ashamed of himself, but he could not stop. After he tied Nana in the backyard, Mr. Darling sat alone for a moment. He put his hands to his eyes and rubbed. He was very unhappy with what he had done. In the meantime, Mrs. Darling put the children to bed. They went quietly as Mrs. Darling lit the night lights. The sound of distant barking entered the room. "Nana's unhappy because Father's chaining her in the yard," John said. "Wendy, listen closely. That's not her sad bark," she said. "That's the bark she gives when she smells danger." Mrs. Darling shivered. "Are you sure, Wendy?" she said nervously. "Oh, yes," Wendy said. Mrs. Darling quivered. She stepped to the window and tested it. It was surely fastened. She looked into the sky. It was filled with stars that seemed to crowd around the house as if they were watching to see what would happen. Mrs. Darling put her hand on her heart. "Oh, I wish I weren't going out tonight," she cried. Micah was already half asleep, but he heard his mother cry. "Can anything harm us when the night lights are on?" he asked quietly. "Nothing, precious," she said. "They are mother's eyes, and they stay behind to guard you." She went from bed to bed, singing a little song of protection over each child. Michael threw his arms around her. "Oh, Mother," he said, "I'm so glad to have you." They were the last words she would hear from him for a long, long time. Mr. and Mrs. Darling stepped out of number 14 and carefully made their way down the street. The moment the door to their home closed, something stirred in the dark, star-filled sky. Often Peter liked to dart behind the stars and try to blow them out, but tonight the stars were watching the street below. They loved fun, and so tonight they were happy to see the grown-ups would not be home. Now Peter, the smallest star in the entire Milky Way, cried out, "Now!" Okay, guys, so that was the second chapter of Peter Pan, and we talked about self-care for mommy as far as for our adults. So we'll come back next week, and we will probably delve into some of the ideas as far as self-care, and we will also continue with the third chapter of Peter Pan, so we can find out what the next part of the adventure is. And until then, this is Dawn, aka the Interactive Nanny, signing off from Interactive Nanny's World, where love and play are interacting. And I hope you guys like, share, subscribe, and we'll be back here next week. Until then, bye bye.